The frosting on Mike's birthday cake looked perfect smooth vanilla buttercream with delicate blue roses Dorothy had piped by hand at 5 in the morning. 42 candles waited in the kitchen drawer. Though she'd only put 4 and 2 on the cake itself, at 67, Dorothy Wilson had learned that some gestures were more about the giver than the receiver. She adjusted her yellow dress, the one Mike had once said made her look presentable, and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back had steel gray hair pulled into a neat bun, lines earned through decades of caring for others, and eyes that held too many unspoken truths. Today felt different, though she couldn't name why. Perhaps it was the weight of the documents she'd organized 3 days ago, now stacked neatly in her home office alongside financial statements Mike had never bothered to examine. The house smelled of roast beef and rosemary potatoes, his favorites. Naturally, she'd spent the morning preparing everything just as she had for the past 25 years of his birthdays. The dining room table gleamed under the crystal chandelier Bob had bought her during their brief but happy marriage 15 years ago. Bob Chen, who'd brought light back into her life after her first husband's death, who'd trusted her with his precious daughter Jessica when she was just 10 years old. Jessica, even thinking her name, brought warmth to Dorothy's chest. At 40 now, Jessica was everything Dorothy could have hoped for in a daughter. Brilliant, compassionate, fiercely loyal. She'd built herself into a formidable architect, partly because of the opportunities Dorothy had quietly provided, but mostly through her own determination. She called every Sunday, visited monthly, and had never once made Dorothy feel like a burden or an obligation. Unlike her biological son, Dorothy heard Mike's key in the lock, followed by the familiar sound of his briefcase hitting the floor with more force than necessary. He was always angry about something these days: the traffic, his employees, the weather, the way she folded his shirts. At 42, Mike had perfected the art of dissatisfaction. What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn, was that Dorothy had been running Wilson Construction from the shadows for the past 15 years. While he gave interviews to trade magazines about his business acumen and spoke at conferences as the company's visionary leader, Dorothy made every major decision. The CFO called her first when problems arose: the expansion into commercial projects, the strategic partnerships that had grown the company from Bob's modest contracting business into a $15 million operation, all Dorothy's work. Mike believed he'd accomplished this through his own brilliance. He had no idea that his signature on contracts was merely a formality, that his authority was an illusion carefully maintained by his mother's love. "Mom, I'm here," he called, his voice carrying that edge of impatience she'd grown to recognize. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie with quick, irritated movements. Mike had inherited his father's sharp features, but none of his kindness. Where Dorothy's first husband had been gentle despite his flaws, Mike was hard edges and cold calculation. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Dorothy said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Everything's ready. I made all your favorites." He glanced at the spread she'd prepared: the roast, the potatoes, the green bean casserole, the cake. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Appreciation. No, more like inventory. He was cataloging her efforts, not with gratitude, but with the cool assessment of someone tallying debts. "Thanks," he said, already heading toward the liquor cabinet. "I need a drink first. It's been a hell of a day." Dorothy watched him pour 3 fingers of expensive whiskey she'd bought specifically for occasions like this. He never asked about her day, never wondered if she'd had a hell of a day. 2. At 67, her days were filled with managing the company he thought he ran, handling investments he didn't know existed, and maintaining the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to without ever questioning where the money came from. "How's the business?" she asked. Though she knew the answer, she'd been reviewing the quarterly reports that morning. "Fine," he said curtly. settling into his chair at the head of the table, the seat that had been Bob's, then became hers after his death, then somehow migrated to Mike without discussion. "I don't know why you insist on staying involved. You don't understand the complexities." Dorothy served his plate, piling it high with food she'd spent hours preparing. "I suppose you're right. I'm just a simple woman." He didn't catch the edge in her voice. Mike had always been remarkably deaf to subtlety when it didn't serve his interests. They ate in relative silence, punctuated only by Mike's complaints about vendors, employees, and market conditions. Dorothy made appropriate sounds of sympathy and concern, playing the role she'd perfected over the years, the devoted mother, the supportive presence, the woman who existed primarily to make his life easier. "I saw Jessica last week," Dorothy mentioned casually, cutting her roast into small pieces. "She's doing wonderful things at her firm, made senior partner, you know." Mike's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Even now, 22 years later, mentioning her stepdaughter could still trigger his resentment. "I'm sure she is," he said. "You always did think she walked on water." "She's worked very hard for her success. Haven't we all?" He took a large gulp of wine. "Some of us just don't have the luxury of starting with advantages." Dorothy set down her fork carefully. This was familiar territory, the subtle accusations. The implication that she'd somehow favored Jessica over him. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mike had inherited more advantages than most people could dream of, but he'd convinced himself he was perpetually shortchanged. "You've had plenty of advantages, Mike," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, like having my mother remarry and suddenly having to share her attention with some other man's kid. Bob was a good man. He was good to both of us. He was good to you. He tolerated me because he had to." Mike's voice was growing harder, the alcohol making him bolder. "What I know is that everything changed when you brought them into our lives. Suddenly. I had to compete for your attention. Had to watch you fuss over that little girl like she was some kind of precious princess." Dorothy thought of 10-year-old Jessica, devastated by her mother's death just 2 years earlier, trying so hard to be good, to not be a burden. She remembered the nights she'd held Jessica while she cried for her mama, the way the child had gradually learned to trust her, to let her love her. She also remembered Mike's sullen resentment, his cold shoulder, his determination to make Jessica feel unwelcome in what he considered his house. But there was more to Mike's story parts Dorothy sometimes forgot in her frustration with his behavior. Mike had been only 7 when his father died in a construction accident. For 5 years. It had been just the two of them against the world. When Dorothy remarried, 12-year-old Mike hadn't just gained a stepfather and stepsister, he'd lost his exclusive claim to his mother's attention. In his child's mind, love was finite, and sharing it meant losing it. "She was a grieving child, Mike. She needed care. And I just lost my father, and then suddenly I had to share my mother with strangers." The candles on his birthday cake seemed to flicker in Dorothy's peripheral vision. 42 candles for 42 years of this. 42 years of walking on eggshells around his feelings, of managing his resentments, of trying to balance his needs against everyone else's. "You never lost me," Dorothy said quietly. "I was always there for you." Mike finished his wine and reached for the bottle. His movements were getting looser, more expansive. "Were you? Because from where I sat, it looked like you were pretty busy playing mother to someone else's kid." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Dorothy felt something inside her go very still, very quiet. This wasn't new. Mike had been perfecting these particular wounds for years. But tonight, on his birthday, surrounded by food she'd made and wine she'd paid for in a house she owned and furnished, something in her reached a breaking point. "I did my best," she said simply. "Your best." Mike leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating look he'd inherited from his father. You want to know what I remember about your best? I remember you teaching her to drive while I had to take the bus. Dorothy remembered differently. She'd offered to teach Mike, but he'd refused, saying he'd figure it out himself, that he didn't need help from anyone. Jessica had quietly asked for lessons and gratefully accepted them. I remember you helping her with college applications while telling me to figure it out myself. Again, Dorothy's memory differed. She'd offered to help Mike, but he'd pushed her away, accusing her of treating him like a child. Jessica had asked for guidance and worked alongside Dorothy for hours perfecting her essays. I remember you crying at her graduation, like she'd just won the Nobel Prize. Dorothy had cried at both graduations, but Mike had specifically asked her not to make a big deal about his ceremony and had been embarrassed when she'd tried to take photos. Jessica had saved her a seat in the front row and thanked Dorothy in her valedictorian speech. Each accusation was a small knife, carefully aimed. The terrible thing was that from Mike's perspective, they held grains of truth. But what he conveniently forgot, what he'd always forgotten, was that by the time Jessica came into their lives, Mike had already established his pattern of rejecting help, of pushing away support, of interpreting every gesture of love as either insufficient or suspect. I helped you too, Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Did you? Mike's laugh was bitter. Name one thing, Mom, one meaningful thing you've done for me. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dorothy could have listed 1,000 things. The sleepless nights when he was sick, the school events she never missed, the way she'd quietly arranged for him to have a management position at the company, the bills she'd paid, the problems she'd solved, the way she'd stepped back and let him believe he was running everything himself. But looking at his face, Dorothy realized the futility of it all. Mike had spent 42 years building a narrative in which he was the victim and she was the inadequate mother. No list of sacrifices would penetrate that armor. No accounting of love given would balance his books of resentment received. She smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and sad and final. You're right, she said. I've never done anything for you. The words seemed to surprise him. He'd been expecting an argument, a defensive recitation of her maternal resume. Instead, she'd given him exactly what he'd asked for validation of his grievances. Well, he said, suddenly looking uncertain, I didn't mean... No, Mike, you're absolutely right. Dorothy stood up, beginning to clear the dishes. I've never done anything meaningful for you, never sacrificed or struggled or worried or worked on your behalf. You've managed everything all by yourself. Mike watched her move around the dining room, his victory hollow when his opponent refused to fight. They finished dinner in silence. Dorothy served the cake, sang happy birthday in a voice that sounded strangely distant to her own ears, and watched him blow out his candles. He made a wish probably for something he believed she'd never given him. After he left, Dorothy sat in the gathering darkness of her dining room, surrounded by the debris of celebration. The house felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending change. Tomorrow, Mike would learn exactly what she'd never done for him. Dorothy didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in Bob's old leather chair and watched the hours crawl toward dawn. At 5:30, she made coffee and called Jessica. Mom? Jessica's voice was thick with sleep, but immediately alert. 22 years of being Dorothy's daughter had taught her to recognize when something was wrong. What's happened? Can you come over this morning? We need to talk. Of course. Give me an hour. Dorothy spent that hour in her home office, a room Mike had never bothered to enter because he assumed it contained nothing more than recipe collections and charity correspondence. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so tragic. Here, surrounded by financial statements and legal documents, Dorothy had spent 15 years quietly building and managing the empire Mike thought he controlled. Wilson Construction had been Bob's modest contracting business when they married a small operation with 3 employees and annual revenues of $200,000. After Bob's death, Dorothy had transformed it into a multi-million-dollar operation through careful expansion, strategic partnerships, and shrewd investments. The real estate portfolio alone was worth $2.8 million, 7 properties across 3 states that Mike didn't even know existed. The investment accounts totaled $3.2 million in diversified holdings that Dorothy managed through a financial advisor Mike had never met. The life insurance policies, the equipment leases, the intellectual property from construction innovations Dorothy had quietly patented, all of it added up to an empire worth over $15 million. Mike believed Wilson Construction was worth maybe $2 million and thought his future inheritance would be comfortable but modest. He had no idea he'd been living his entire adult life supported by wealth that dwarfed his imagination. Jessica arrived precisely 1 hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop near her apartment. At 40, Jessica had inherited Bob's height and her birth mother's delicate features, but her strength was entirely her own creation. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look younger than her years, though her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her one of the youngest senior partners at her architectural firm. "You look terrible," Jessica said, settling into the chair across from Dorothy's desk with the blunt honesty that had always characterized their relationship. "I feel terrible." Dorothy slid a thick folder across her desk. Mike's birthday dinner didn't go well. Jessica opened the folder and began reading. Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips as she processed the scope of what Dorothy was showing her. "Mom," she breathed, This is massive. I had no idea." The documents detailed everything: the true value of Wilson Construction, the property holdings, the investment portfolios, the life insurance policies. More importantly, they showed the legal transfers Dorothy had been preparing for the past month, transfers that would make Jessica the sole owner of everything Mike believed he would inherit. "He told me I've never done anything for him," Dorothy said quietly. "And I realized he was absolutely right, so I've decided to stop trying." Jessica set down the papers carefully. "Mom, this is nuclear. He'll be devastated." "Good." The word came out harder than Dorothy had intended, carrying decades of suppressed anger. Jessica had heard Dorothy frustrated, disappointed, even hurt. But she'd never heard her sound ruthless. "I need you to understand something," Dorothy continued. "This isn't a momentary decision, born from one hurtful comment. This is the culmination of 42 years of watching my son systematically diminish every gesture of love I've made toward him. He's convinced himself that I'm a failure as a mother, that I've never provided him with anything of value. So I'm going to give him the gift of being right." Jessica studied the legal documents again. "Where will you go?" "I've bought a house in Asheville. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I'll transfer there quietly. Set up a new life." Dorothy paused, studying Jessica's face. "The question is whether you want to take on Wilson Construction. It's a good company, profitable, with excellent growth potential. But it also means dealing with Mike when he realizes what's happened. He'll fight this legally. He can try, but he has no legal standing. The company has always been in my name. Bob left it to me, not to Mike. The house is mine. The investments are mine. Mike has been living in a fantasy where hard work and masculine authority entitled him to ownership. But legal reality is different." Jessica was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the logistics, but the emotional earthquake Dorothy was describing. "He's going to hate me even more than he already does," she said finally. "He'll blame me for this. He'll say I manipulated you, turned you against him. Let him." "Mom, are you sure about this?" Once you do this, there's no going back. Mike will never forgive you." Dorothy thought about Mike's face the night before, the cold calculation in his eyes as he delivered his verdict on her maternal failures. She thought about the years she'd spent walking on eggshells, trying to balance his needs against everyone else's, accepting blame for his disappointments and credit for none of his successes. "I don't want his forgiveness," she said. "I want my freedom." The transfer process began at dawn on Saturday, executed with the precision of a military operation Dorothy had been planning for weeks. She sat in her home office at 6 a.m., watching the sunrise paint her backyard in shades of gold while she made the final phone calls that would dismantle Mike's world. Mrs. Wilson, the voice of her attorney, Margaret Chen Jessica's cousin, as it happened, was crisp and professional. "All documents have been filed with the state. The ownership transfers are legally complete as of 6:15 this morning. Wilson Construction, all associated assets, and the property holdings now belong to Jessica Chen." Dorothy felt a strange mix of liberation and loss. "And the house? Sale closed yesterday evening. The new owners take possession Monday, but Jessica has granted you through the weekend to complete your transition." Dorothy looked around the office where she'd spent 15 years secretly running a multi-million-dollar empire. By Monday morning, this room would belong to strangers, and Mike would discover that the foundation of his entire identity had been built on quicksand. The irony was almost too perfect. Mike had always dismissed her home office as Mom's little hobby space, never bothering to investigate what she actually did during the long hours she spent behind the closed door. If he'd shown even casual interest in her life, he might have discovered the truth years ago. Instead, his willful ignorance had made his own downfall possible. Dorothy's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Moving truck arrives at 2 p.m. for your remaining items." "Are you sure about the timeline?" she typed back. "Positive. Mike's golf tournament ends at 4. He'll go straight to his house. This gives us time." The movers arrived precisely at 2 p.m., a small crew Jessica had hired from outside Charlotte to avoid local gossip. Dorothy had already packed most of her personal belongings over the past month, taking a few items each week and storing them in a rented unit. Today, only the furniture she'd selected for her new life in Asheville remained. Watching strangers wrap her grandmother's china in newspaper, Dorothy felt the weight of endings and beginnings. Each piece they loaded represented a choice what to carry forward, what to leave behind. The crystal chandelier that had presided over so many family dinners stayed. The dining room table, where Mike had delivered his devastating verdict, would go to charity. Some memories deserved preservation. Others required burial. At 3:30, Dorothy did a final walk through the empty house. Her footsteps echoed in rooms that had once been filled with the sounds of family life birthday parties, holiday celebrations, quiet evenings when the distance between her and Mike hadn't seemed insurmountable. She paused in the kitchen where she'd prepared thousands of meals, in the living room where she'd helped Tyler with homework just weeks ago, in Mike's old bedroom where she'd once read bedtime stories to a little boy who still believed his mother could fix anything. The house held 43 years of her life, but it also held 43 years of feeling like a guest in her own home, carefully managing everyone else's emotions while her own needs remained invisible. As Dorothy pulled out of the driveway for the last time, she felt grief mixed with profound relief. The drive to Asheville took 3 hours through mountain roads that grew more beautiful as she climbed higher. Dorothy had visited her new house only twice, once to buy it, once to supervise basic preparations. It was a modest craftsman cottage on 2 acres outside the city, with a wraparound porch and views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. After decades in Charlotte's suburban sprawl, the silence felt like a luxury. She spent Saturday evening unpacking essentials and calling Jessica with updates. "How are you feeling?" Jessica asked, her voice soft with concern. "Free." Dorothy answered, surprising herself with the honesty. Scared but free. Do you want me there when Mike— No. This is something he needs to face alone. But be ready for him to call you. He'll be looking for someone to blame. And you're the obvious target. I can handle Mike. Dorothy smiled despite her anxiety. Yes, you can. You always could. That's part of what made him so resentful. Sunday passed quietly. Dorothy arranged furniture, planted herbs in the small garden, and tried not to think about what would happen Monday morning. She'd left Mike a letter, but she'd also left one for Tyler and Emma to be opened when they were older, an explanation of why Grandma Dot had disappeared from their lives, written with the hope that someday they might understand her choice. At 9:15, Monday morning, Dorothy's phone rang. Jessica's number appeared on the screen. He knows, Jessica said without preamble. I can hear him shouting from here. Dorothy closed her eyes, imagining the scene playing out in Charlotte. Mike's weekend golf tournament would have ended around 4 p.m. Sunday, followed by the traditional dinner and drinks with his foursome. He'd probably arrived at Wilson Construction Monday morning hungover and expecting a routine week, only to find his world exploded. Are you all right? Dorothy asked. I'm fine. The lawyers are handling everything professionally. But Mom. Jessica's voice dropped. I've never seen him like this. He's not just angry. He's devastated. Dorothy felt a pang of something that might have been regret, quickly suppressed. Devastation is what happens when delusions collapse. He'll survive it. He's demanding to know where you are. Tell him I'm building a new life somewhere he can't touch it. Meanwhile, at Wilson Construction, Mike was living through the most humiliating morning of his life. He'd arrived at the office to find his keycard deactivated and unfamiliar cars in the executive parking lot. The security guard, someone Mike had greeted casually for 6 years, had looked at him with uncomfortable sympathy. Sorry, Mr. Wilson, you'll need to check in with the front desk. The front desk, Mike had stared at Gary, the security guard, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. I think there's been some mistake. No mistake, sir. New ownership took effect this morning. The next hour had unfolded like a nightmare from which Mike couldn't wake. Lawyers explaining that he'd never owned anything, accountants showing him documents that revealed the true scope of his mother's empire, Harrison Webb, his own CFO, confirming that yes, Dorothy had been the real decision-maker for years. She what? Mike had asked when Harrison explained how the major contracts had actually been negotiated. Your mother handled all strategic decisions. Mike, she'd review proposals, set parameters, then ask me to present them to you for your approval. You thought you were making the choices, but she'd already made them. The revelation was like discovering that his entire professional life had been an elaborate theatrical performance, with him as the unwitting actor delivering lines someone else had written. Margaret Chen, the lead attorney, had been professionally sympathetic but uncompromising in her explanations. Your mother was very thorough in her preparation. Mr. Wilson, every transfer has been properly documented and filed. Ms. Jessica Chen is now the legal owner of Wilson Construction, all associated properties, and the investment portfolio your mother accumulated over the past 15 years. Investment portfolio, Mike's voice had cracked. What investment portfolio? Real estate holdings valued at approximately $2.8 million, diversified stock and bond accounts totaling $3.2 million, and various other assets. The total value of the transferred property exceeds $15 million. Mike had actually laughed a short, hysterical sound that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. $15 million. He'd been living his entire adult life supported by wealth he'd never known existed, while complaining that his mother had never done anything for him. The letter from Dorothy had been the final devastating blow. Reading her words, Mike finally understood the scope of his miscalculation. He'd spent 42 years treating his mother like a supporting character in his own story, never recognizing that he'd been a supporting character in hers. Harrison Webb had watched Mike read the letter with the uncomfortable expression of a man witnessing someone else's complete breakdown. "What happens now?" Mike had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That depends on Ms. Chen," Harrison replied. "She's asked to meet with you this afternoon to discuss your future with the company." "My future with the company I thought I owned, Mike." And Harrison's voice held decades of friendship and professional respect. "For what it's worth, your mother never intended to hurt you. She just wanted to feel appreciated." "Appreciated?" Mike's laugh was bitter. "She wanted to feel appreciated, so she destroyed my life. Did she destroy your life, or did she just stop protecting you from reality?" The question hung in the air as Mike packed his personal belongings under security supervision. Family photos, a few books, the awards he'd won for business leadership awards that now felt like participation trophies given to a child who'd been allowed to believe he was really playing the game. As Mike carried his boxes to his car, he tried calling Dorothy one final time. The number went straight to a generic voicemail message. "You have reached a number that is no longer in service." Even his mother's phone number had been erased. Sitting in the parking lot of the company he'd believed he would inherit, Mike stared at the building where he'd worked for the past 6 years. The Wilson construction sign still bore his family name, but it no longer belonged to him. Jessica Chen would probably change it. He realized, erase the last visible connection between the Wilson family and the empire Dorothy had built. For the first time since childhood, Mike Wilson had absolutely no idea what would happen next in his life. The scripts his mother had written, the safety net she'd provided, the identity she'd carefully constructed for him, all of it was gone. He was 42 years old, unemployed, and completely alone with the consequences of his choices. The liberation Dorothy felt in her mountain cottage was Mike's prison, and the freedom she'd claimed for herself was the cage he'd built for himself through decades of willful blindness and endless entitlement. Tomorrow, he would have to face Jessica and ask for mercy from the woman he'd spent 22 years trying to make feel unwelcome in her own family. The irony was perfect, devastating, and entirely of his own making. Mike's meeting with Jessica on Monday afternoon lasted exactly 12 minutes. He sat across from her in what had been his office, still his office in his mind, watching her read through an employment contract with the methodical precision that had always irritated him. "Site manager," Jessica said without looking up. $60,000 annually, plus performance bonuses if projects meet deadlines and stay under budget. Direct reporting to project management, with quarterly reviews. Mike stared at the number. $60,000 was less than half his previous salary, barely enough to cover his mortgage payment. That's it. It's more than you'd get anywhere else without actual construction experience. Jessica finally met his eyes. "Or you can decline and find employment elsewhere. Your choice." The casual way she delivered the ultimatum, the complete reversal of their lifetime power dynamic, made Mike's humiliation burn hotter. This was Jessica Chen, the scared little girl who'd once begged him to include her in his games, now deciding his professional fate with boardroom indifference. "I built this company," Mike said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "No, Mike. You managed daily operations while Dorothy built this company. There's a difference." "She's turned you against me." Jessica leaned back in the leather chair, his chair, and studied him with an expression that mixed pity with professional disappointment. "Dorothy didn't turn me against you. Mike, you did that yourself. Over 22 years of making me feel unwelcome in my own family." Mike signed the contract because he had no choice, but his signature felt like surrender. As he left the building that evening, he passed employees who'd once deferred to his authority. Now they watched him with curious sympathy, gossiping in whispers about the family drama that had reshuffled their corporate hierarchy overnight. By Tuesday, Mike had called 3 employment attorneys. The second one, Harold Manning, was a hungry younger lawyer who smelled publicity in the case. "Elder abuse," Manning said, leaning forward in his cramped downtown office. "That's the angle. Your mother was manipulated by someone with financial motivation. We paint Jessica as a calculating opportunist who isolated your mother and convinced her to transfer assets illegally." "But the transfers were legal," Mike protested. "The lawyers made that clear. Legal doesn't mean ethical. We challenge competency, undue influence, coercion. Even if we lose, the publicity alone might pressure them into a settlement." Mike hesitated. Some part of him, the part that remembered Dorothy's devastated expression when he'd accused her of never doing anything for him, whispered that this was wrong. But that voice was drowned out by the louder chorus of his wounded pride and growing financial panic. What would that cost? 50,000 retainer, but I think we can get some media interest. Sometimes public pressure works better than legal pressure. Mike wrote the check that afternoon, using money from a credit line secured against his expected inheritance, an inheritance that no longer existed. Manning worked fast. By Thursday fall, he'd contacted Charlotte Business Weekly, painting Mike as a devoted son betrayed by a manipulative adoptive daughter who'd turned his vulnerable mother against him. The story Manning told bore only passing resemblance to reality, but it was compelling in its simplicity. Successful businessman destroyed by family greed and manipulation. The article ran the following Monday with the headline, "Local CEO Stripped of Family Business by Adopted Daughter." The accompanying photo showed Mike in his office from 6 months ago, looking confident and authoritative, a stark contrast to his current reality. Michael Wilson spent 15 years building Wilson Construction into a regional powerhouse. But last week, he arrived at work to find himself locked out of his own company. The business his late stepfather left to his mother has been transferred to Jessica Chen, Wilson's adopted sister, in what family law experts are calling a highly unusual asset transfer that bypasses the biological heir. "This isn't about business," Wilson told Charlotte Business Weekly. "This is about a pattern of manipulation that's been going on for years. My stepsister has always resented that I was the biological son, and she's finally found a way to cut me out entirely." His sources close to the family suggest that Dorothy Wilson, 67, may have been influenced by Chen's professional success and geographic proximity. While Michael Wilson focused on building the family business, the article was a masterpiece of selective editing and strategic omissions. It mentioned nothing about Mike's behavior toward Jessica over the years, nothing about Dorothy's actual role in building the company, and nothing about the entitlement and ingratitude that had driven Dorothy to her breaking point. The response was immediate and devastating for Jessica. Long-time clients called Wilson Construction, demanding explanations. Robert Henderson from Henderson General Contracting, Wilson's biggest competitor, called Jessica personally. "I have to ask, Jessica, is the company stable? Because if there's family turmoil affecting operations, we need to consider our options. The company is completely stable. Mr. Henderson, I've been involved in strategic planning for months." "But you're not family. Are you, you're adopted." The question hit Jessica like a slap. After 22 years as Dorothy's daughter, she was being reduced to her outsider status by people who'd never questioned her belonging before. 3 major contracts were put under review by Wednesday. Employees gathered in nervous clusters, whispering about job security and company stability. The stock price Wilson Construction had gone public 3 years earlier dropped 12% in 2 days. Jessica called an emergency board meeting for Thursday morning, sitting at the head of the conference table where Mike had once presided. She faced 12 board members who suddenly looked at her with suspicious uncertainty. "The media coverage is highly biased," Jessica explained, maintaining professional composure despite her inner turmoil. "Michael Wilson has been an employee, not an owner, for his entire tenure. Dorothy Wilson built this company from a small contracting business into what you see today." Board member Patricia Williams, a longtime family friend, leaned forward with uncomfortable concern. "Jessica, dear, we all know you're capable, but this situation, it's causing market uncertainty. Some of our institutional investors are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About succession planning, about family stability, about whether this transfer was appropriate." The word appropriate hung in the air like an accusation. Jessica realized that despite her professional credentials and years of involvement with the company, she would always be seen by some as an interloper who'd manipulated her way into an inheritance that should have gone to the real son. "I'm prepared to buy out any investors who want to exit," Jessica said quietly. "With what capital?" Williams asked. "The banks are nervous about lending against assets involved in family disputes." By Friday, Jessica was facing the possibility that she might have to sell Wilson Construction to avoid bankruptcy, not from company performance, but from public relations disaster created by Mike's media campaign. Meanwhile, in Asheville, Dorothy was experiencing her own crisis. Her new neighbors, kind people who'd welcomed her warmly, began looking at her with uncomfortable questions in their eyes. Someone had forwarded them the Charlotte Business Weekly article. "Mrs. Wilson," said her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, catching Dorothy at her mailbox. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but that article in the Charlotte paper, is everything all right with your family?" Dorothy felt the sting of public humiliation in a way she'd never experienced. Mike's private cruelties had been contained within family walls, but now her personal pain was entertainment for strangers. "Family matters are complicated, Mrs. Patterson," Dorothy replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Of course, dear. It's just that the article made it sound like, well, like you might have been taken advantage of. If you need help..." The implication that she was a confused elderly woman who'd been manipulated by her adopted daughter made Dorothy's chest tighten with anger and grief. Mike wasn't just attacking Jessica. He was attacking Dorothy's competence, her autonomy, her right to make decisions about her own life. That evening, Jessica called with an update on the business crisis. "Mom, I don't know if I can hold this together. We've lost the Harrison Municipal Project, and 3 other clients are threatening to leave. The board is talking about selling to Henderson Construction." Dorothy closed her eyes, feeling the weight of unintended consequences. She'd wanted to teach Mike about gratitude and responsibility, but instead had created a war that was destroying everything she'd worked to build. "What about Mike? He's making it worse. He's giving interviews, spreading rumors about company instability, telling clients that I'm inexperienced and that the business will fail under outside management." Dorothy felt something crack in her chest literally. The stress of the situation, combined with the mountain altitude and her age, triggered heart palpitations that sent her to Asheville Regional Medical Center at 2 a.m. Saturday morning. Lying in the emergency room, surrounded by strangers and hooked to heart monitors, Dorothy faced the possibility that her quest for independence had cost her everything that mattered. Jessica was suffering, the company was failing, and Mike was destroying himself with bitterness and revenge. But Mike was suffering too, though his pain was largely self-inflicted. The legal fees were draining his savings faster than he'd anticipated. Amanda had initially supported his fight, but as their financial situation became clear, her support turned to panic and then to anger. "400,000, Mike?" Amanda stared at the bankruptcy attorney's assessment of their debt. "We owe $400,000 secured against an inheritance that doesn't exist." They sat in their kitchen in the house they could no longer afford, while Tyler and Emma played in the living room, oblivious to the financial catastrophe engulfing their family. "It's temporary," Mike insisted. "Once we get the settlement..." "There's not going to be a settlement." Amanda's voice rose to a near shout. "Your lawyer is taking your money to fight a case he can't win, while our children's college funds disappear and our house goes into foreclosure. Keep your voice down. The kids..." The kids are going to be homeless. Mike, do you understand that? We're going to lose everything because you couldn't accept that your mother had the right to give her own property to whoever she wanted. Amanda's words cut deep because they contained truth Mike wasn't ready to face. He'd spent weeks telling himself that this was about justice, about fighting manipulation and family loyalty. But at 3 a.m., lying awake while Amanda slept on the couch, Mike knew that his real motivation was much simpler and more shameful. He couldn't bear that Jessica had won. The breaking point came when Amanda filed for separation and petitioned for sole custody of Tyler and Emma. The court documents, served to Mike at his construction site job, painted him as emotionally unstable and obsessed with family conflicts to the detriment of his children's well-being. The petitioner believes the respondent's judgment has been impaired by his fixation on family financial disputes. The document read, "The children have been exposed to inappropriate adult conflicts and financial stress that affects their emotional security." Mike read the custody petition in his truck during lunch break, his hands shaking as he processed the implications. Amanda wasn't just leaving him, she was taking Tyler and Emma, the only relationships in his life that were still pure and uncomplicated. That evening, 5-year-old Tyler found Mike sitting on the front steps of their house, staring at nothing. "Daddy," Tyler said, settling beside him with the unselfconscious affection of a child who still believed his father could fix anything. "Why are you always angry now? Did we do something wrong?" Mike looked at his son's worried face and felt something crack inside his chest. Tyler had his grandmother's eyes, Dorothy's eyes, and in them, Mike saw everything he'd lost through his own choices. "No, buddy," Mike said, pulling Tyler close. "You and Emma didn't do anything wrong. Daddy made some mistakes. Can you fix them?" The question hung in the evening air like a challenge. Mike had spent months trying to fix his situation through lawyers and media campaigns and public attacks on the people who'd hurt him. But looking at Tyler's trusting face, Mike finally understood that the only mistake that really mattered was the one he'd been making for 42 years, treating love like a limited resource instead of something that grew when shared. "I don't know, Tyler," Mike said honestly. "But I'm going to try." That night, for the first time since the transfers had been revealed, Mike called Jessica directly, not to argue or demand or threaten, but to ask a single question that took more courage than anything he'd ever done. "Jessica, is she okay? Is Mom okay?" Jessica's answer that Dorothy was in the hospital, alone and heartbroken, finally showed Mike the true cost of his war. The storm he'd created was destroying everyone he'd ever claimed to love, including himself. It was time to stop fighting and start rebuilding, even if it meant swallowing his pride completely. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting Mike from the restless sleep that had become his norm since Amanda moved out. An unfamiliar number glowed on his phone screen, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. The only calls he received anymore were from creditors or reporters seeking follow-up quotes for their family drama stories. "Mr. Wilson." The voice was professional but gentle, with the practiced compassion of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "This is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Asheville Regional Medical Center. Your mother, Dorothy Wilson, has been admitted with cardiac complications. She's stable now, but she was asking for you." Mike sat up in his empty bed, his mind struggling to process the words. Cardiac complications. Stress-induced arrhythmia, most likely. Her blood pressure was dangerously elevated when she arrived. "Mr. Wilson, I think it would be good if you could come. She's been asking for her son." So, the words hit Mike like a physical blow. After everything he'd done, the media campaign, the public humiliation, the attacks on Jessica Dorothy, was still asking for him, her son. Not her former son, not the ungrateful child who'd betrayed her trust, but simply her son. "I'll be there in 3 hours," Mike said. already reaching for his clothes. The drive to Asheville through empty mountain highways gave Mike time to think, really think, for the first time in months. Without the constant noise of legal meetings and media interviews and financial crisis management, he found himself confronting the uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding. He'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone driven by wounded pride and self-righteous anger rather than love or principle. Jessica had been right when she'd told him Dorothy hadn't turned her against him. He'd done that himself, over years of small cruelties and casual dismissals. And now he'd extended that same treatment to his mother, the woman who'd literally built his entire life while he'd complained about her inadequacy. Mike arrived at the hospital as dawn was breaking over the Blue Ridge Mountains. He'd never been to Asheville before, had never bothered to visit the place his mother had chosen for her new life. The city was smaller than Charlotte, surrounded by rolling hills that were just beginning to show the first hints of fall color. It looked peaceful in a way that Charlotte never had the kind of place where someone might go to heal from old wounds. Dorothy was awake when he found her room, though she looked smaller than he remembered, fragile against the white hospital sheets. Her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual neat bun, and without makeup, her 77 years showed in ways that made Mike's chest tighten with unexpected tenderness. "Mike?" she said softly when she saw him in the doorway. "You came?" "Of course I came." He approached her bed cautiously, unsure of his welcome. "How are you feeling? Like I'm too old for this much drama?" Dorothy's smile was tired but genuine. "The doctors say it was stress-related. Apparently I'm not handling retirement as well as I thought." Mike pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down, studying his mother's face, without the familiar backdrop of the house where he'd grown up, without the context of family dinners and birthday celebrations and all the rituals that had defined their relationship. Dorothy looked different to him, not like the woman who existed to serve his needs, but like a person with her own struggles and fears and desires. "Mom," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you wrote in that letter, about never teaching me gratitude or consequences." Dorothy waited, not offering easy absolution or rushing to fill the silence. "I think you're right," Mike continued, "but I've been trying to understand why I became someone who could treat you the way I did, and I think it started when Dad died." Dorothy's expression softened slightly. Mike so rarely talked about his father, had always seemed to resent any mention of the man whose death had reshaped both their lives. "I was 7, Mike said, his voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed memories. "And for 5 years, it was just us. You were everything to me, my whole world. When you remarried, when Jessica came, I felt like I was losing you, like love was finite, and I had to compete for my share." "Love isn't finite, Mike. I know that now, or I'm starting to understand it. But I was 12, and scared, and I built this whole story about being cheated, being overlooked, and it was easier to keep believing that story than to admit I'd been wrong for 30 years. Dorothy studied her son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated remorse. Instead, she saw something she hadn't seen since he was a child: genuine vulnerability. "The media campaign," Mike continued, his voice thick with shame. "The attacks on Jessica, the lies about you being manipulated. I knew it was wrong. Mom, I knew it, but I couldn't stop myself. I was so angry, so humiliated, and I wanted someone else to be the villain so I wouldn't have to look at my own failures. And now I see what I've done. Jessica's company is failing because of lies I told. You're in the hospital because of stress I caused. Amanda's leaving me and taking the kids because I've become someone even I don't recognize." Mike leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't know how to fix this. Mom, I don't know how to undo the damage I've caused." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, processing not just Mike's words but the way he'd said them. This wasn't the calculated apology of someone seeking advantage, but the raw confession of someone who'd finally seen himself clearly and didn't like what he'd found. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why what? Why do you want to fix it? Is it because you're facing consequences you don't like? Or because you finally understand what you've lost?" Mike considered the question seriously. "Both. Maybe I hate that I'm losing Tyler and Emma. Hate that I can't pay my bills. Hate that people look at me with pity instead of respect. But more than that." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he'd never examined. "I hate who I've become. I hate that I turned into someone who could attack you publicly, who could try to destroy Jessica out of spite. I hate that I taught my children to see me as angry and bitter instead of loving and supportive." "What about Jessica? What about her? Do you plan to keep fighting her? Keep trying to prove that she manipulated me into giving her assets that were rightfully yours?" Mike flinched at the directness of the question. Those assets were never rightfully mine. Were they, I mean? Legally, they were always yours. But more than that, I never earned them. I just expected them. That's not what you've been telling the newspapers. I've been telling the newspapers what I needed to believe to avoid facing the truth. Mike met his mother's eyes. "The truth is that you built Wilson Construction into something amazing, while I took credit for your work. The truth is that Jessica earned your love and trust, while I demanded it as my birthright. The truth is that I've been a terrible son, and instead of trying to be better, I blamed you for not loving me enough." Dorothy felt something loosen in her chest, not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it. She'd spent 42 years hoping Mike would develop the self-awareness he was finally showing, but she'd learned to be cautious about trusting his moments of insight. "If you mean what you're saying," she said carefully, "then you need to prove it through actions, not words. You need to retract the media statements, apologize to Jessica publicly, and stop undermining the company. And if I do that, if I try to undo the damage I've caused, then maybe, eventually, we can find a way to rebuild some kind of relationship. Not the old relationship that's broken beyond repair, but something new, based on mutual respect instead of obligation." Mike nodded, accepting the conditions without argument. "What about Tyler and Emma? Will they ever see their grandmother again?" Dorothy's composure cracked slightly at the mention of her grandchildren. "I've missed them terribly. But I won't use them as leverage against you, and I won't put them in the middle of adult conflicts. If you want them to have a relationship with me, you'll need to find a way to make that possible without drama or manipulation." "I understand." Mike stood to leave, then turned back. "Mom, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I'm sorry. Not just sorry that I'm facing consequences, but sorry that I hurt you. Sorry that I wasted 42 years of your love. Sorry that I almost lost you completely because I was too proud to see what I was throwing away." Dorothy nodded slowly. "It's a start, Mike, but sorry is just the beginning. Now comes the hard part, proving that you've actually changed." As Mike drove back to Charlotte, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not hope that he could return to his old life that was impossible now, but hope that he might be able to build something better from the wreckage of his choices. The first step would be the hardest calling Charlotte Business Weekly, and admitting that everything he'd told them about Jessica and Dorothy had been a lie born from his own wounded pride and refusal to accept responsibility for his failures. The second step would be even harder, learning to live with the consequences of his actions while slowly, carefully, trying to earn back the trust of the people he'd hurt. But for the first time since this whole crisis began, Mike felt like he had a path forward, not back to where he'd been, but toward becoming the person he should have been all along. The mountain's sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and pink as Mike drove toward an uncertain but honest future, carrying with him the fragile hope that love, like trust, could be rebuilt if tended with enough patience and care. Mike's public retraction appeared in Charlotte Business Weekly 3 weeks later. The article was a complete reversal of his previous position, an admission that he had lied about Jessica's role in the family conflict, and an acknowledgement that Dorothy had built Wilson Construction into the success it had become. "I allowed my personal disappointment and wounded pride to cloud my judgment," Mike wrote. "I attacked my stepsister Jessica Chen publicly because I couldn't accept that my mother had the right to make her own decisions about her property. Ms. Chen has shown remarkable grace in offering me continued employment despite my unprofessional behavior. I apologize unreservedly to her, to my mother, and to the business community for my actions." The apology didn't undo all the damage, but it began the process of repair. Several clients who had left Wilson Construction reached out to Jessica, expressing interest in resuming their relationships. The company's stock price stabilized, and the board withdrew their discussions about selling. Mike moved into a one-bedroom apartment and began his new role as site manager. The work was humbling. He was responsible for day-to-day operations at construction sites, reporting to project managers who had once been his subordinates. But for the first time in years, Mike felt like he was earning his paycheck through actual work rather than perceived inheritance. Jessica proved to be a capable and innovative leader. She modernized the company's technology systems, expanded into sustainable construction practices, and established partnerships with minority-owned businesses that opened new market opportunities. Mike watched his stepsister transform Wilson Construction in ways he'd never imagined, and felt something he'd never experienced before: genuine admiration for her abilities. 3 months after the public apology, Mike wrote his first letter to Dorothy, not asking for forgiveness or demanding reconciliation, but simply acknowledging the hurt he'd caused and the lessons he was learning. Dorothy's response was brief but not hostile. "I'm glad you're learning. Mike, change is harder than apologies, but it's what matters." The first real breakthrough came when Tyler drew a picture of Dorothy in her mountain garden and asked Mike to send it to her. Dorothy called that evening the first time she'd spoken to Mike since the hospital. "Tyler's drawing is beautiful," she said. "How is he adjusting to everything?" "It's been hard," Mike admitted. "The divorce, moving apartments, changing schools. But he's resilient. Emma, too. They still ask about you every day." "I miss them. Would you consider a visit? I know it's complicated. But they need their grandmother." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not ready to forgive you, Mike, but I'm willing to let you try to earn it. If you bring them for a weekend, you can stay in town, but not in my house. And if you revert to your old patterns, if you make our relationship about what I owe you instead of what you're willing to give, then it's over permanently." "I understand." Mike drove Tyler and Emma to Asheville the following weekend. Dorothy had prepared the guest room with care, filling it with toys and books she'd bought specifically for their visit. The children's joy at seeing their grandmother was pure and uncomplicated, and watching them together reminded Mike of what he'd almost destroyed permanently. Dorothy was polite but distant with Mike, speaking to him only when necessary for coordinating the children's activities. But she noticed things: how Mike patiently helped Tyler with his shoelaces, how he read to Emma without being asked, how he encouraged the children to thank Dorothy for every kindness instead of treating her generosity as expected. On Sunday evening, as Mike prepared to take the children home, Dorothy pulled him aside. "You're different with them than you used to be with me." "I'm trying to be better." "Why?" Mike considered the question seriously. "Because I don't want them to grow up feeling entitled to love without giving it back. Because I want them to understand that relationships require effort from both sides. Because I finally learned the difference between being loved and being loving." Dorothy nodded slowly. "It's a start." 6 months later, Dorothy hosted Tyler's 6th birthday party at her mountain home. The gathering was small, Mike. Amanda, who had reconciled with Mike after seeing genuine changes in his behavior, the children, and Jessica, who had driven down from Charlotte for the weekend. The dynamics were still delicate. Dorothy remained cautious with Mike, their conversations polite but not yet warm. Jessica and Mike had developed a professional working relationship, but personal trust was still being rebuilt slowly. Amanda, pragmatic as always, focused on the children's well-being rather than nursing old grievances, but progress was visible in small gestures. Mike had helped Dorothy plant a vegetable garden that spring, working alongside her without complaint when she criticized his technique. Jessica sought Dorothy's advice on major business decisions, not from obligation, but from genuine respect for her experience. The children moved easily between all the adults, unaware of the careful negotiations that made their happiness possible. During the party, Dorothy watched Tyler attempt to plant sunflower seeds in her garden. His small hands struggled with the spacing, and Mike knelt beside him to demonstrate the proper technique. "Grandma Dot," Tyler said, looking up from his work, "why do you plant seeds so far apart? Don't they want to be together?" Dorothy smiled, meeting Mike's eyes over Tyler's head. "Some things need space to grow properly. Sweetheart, if you plant them too close together, they compete for sunlight and nutrients. But if you give them room and tend them carefully, they can grow stronger than you ever imagined." "Will mine grow big like yours?" "That depends," Dorothy said, "on how well you take care of them." Mike understood the metaphor, as Dorothy knew he would. Relationships, like gardens, required patience, attention, and respect for natural boundaries. Love couldn't be forced or demanded. It had to be cultivated through consistent, genuine care. As the party wound down and families prepared to leave, Jessica pulled Dorothy aside. "Are you happy?" Jessica asked. "Really happy. Not just making the best of things." Dorothy looked around her small mountain home. So different from the grand house where she'd spent most of her adult life. The space was hers entirely, filled with things she'd chosen rather than inherited or accepted. Through the window, she could see Tyler and Emma playing in the garden they'd helped plant, Mike and Amanda watching them with the relaxed attention of parents who weren't constantly fighting. "Yes," Dorothy said. "I'm happy. Not because everything's perfect, but because it's honest. For the first time in decades, the people in my life are here because they choose to be, not because they expect something from me." "Do you think Mike will keep changing?" "I think he's learning that love is something you do, not something you deserve. Whether he keeps learning depends on him." As the cars pulled away from her driveway, Dorothy stood on her porch, watching the mountain sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. In her pocket, she carried Tyler's latest drawing, a picture of the whole family standing together in the garden, everyone smiling under a bright yellow sun. At 67, Dorothy had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's worst impulses. Sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it entirely. And sometimes the gift of nothing, no unearned support, no unquestioned forgiveness, no love without accountability, is the most valuable thing you can give. The mountains stood silent around her home, offering no judgment, asking nothing, giving everything. It was enough. Finally, it was enough. But now, it was also a beginning,